The day my mother told me to leave her house, she did not even look at me when she said it. She was standing at the kitchen counter, her back turned, and her voice was flat and certain, like she had already made peace with the decision before she even spoke it out loud. I had lived in that house for 26 years. I had cooked in that kitchen, cleaned those floors, stayed up late paying bills when money was short, and sat beside my grandmother in that same living room every evening for 3 years while she got older and weaker and needed someone close. And in one moment, over a small blue savings book that I did not take, I became someone my mother was willing to throw away. The worst part was not the accusation itself. The worst part was watching my sister stand in the doorway behind our mother, quiet, with her arms crossed, not saying a single word to stop it. I remember thinking as I picked up my bag that some people spend their whole lives hoping to matter to the people who are supposed to love them first. Then something happened that made my mother understand, very clearly and very finally, exactly what she had chosen to throw away. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something. If the person who raised you accused you of something you did not do, and the sibling you had defended your whole life stayed completely silent while it happened, what would you do? Would you fight to prove yourself? Would you walk out with your head down and your heart broken? Or would you wait quietly for the truth to find its own way to the surface? Stay with Patricia on this one because the answer she found was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it changed everything. Patricia Marlowe was 26 years old when her mother told her to get out. She was not a dramatic person, she was not a fighter. She was, by almost every measure, the kind of woman who kept things running quietly so that no one else had to think too hard about the details. She paid attention, she remembered things, she showed up when other people found excuses not to. She was the one in the family who sat down with the utility bill and figured out which service to switch to save $40 a month. She was the one who drove her grandmother to the cardiologist twice a month for 3 years without being asked a second time. She was the one who stayed home on the weekends not because she had nowhere else to be, but because she understood that someone had to, and she loved her grandmother enough to make that someone herself. Her name was Vera, her grandmother. Vera Marlowe was 79 years old, sharp-minded even when her body started to slow down, and the kind of woman who noticed everything even when she pretended not to. She had a way of watching a room that made you feel like she was quietly keeping records. She had lived in the family home for decades, a wide single-story house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood in central Georgia, where the oak trees grew so thick over the street that the light came through in pieces. Vera had bought that house with her late husband before Patricia's mother, Sandra, was even born. It had always been Vera's house. It just happened to be the house where Patricia had grown up too. Sandra Marlowe was the kind of mother who loved her children loudly and unevenly. She said she did not have favorites. She said that so often and with such practiced certainty that Patricia eventually understood it was something Sandra needed to believe about herself rather than something that was actually true. Because if you watched closely enough, and Patricia had spent her whole life watching closely, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Sandra's younger daughter, Renee, was 2 years younger than Patricia, lighter in spirit, more social, more likely to make Sandra laugh at the dinner table. Renee had a way of smoothing things over and making the room feel easy, and Sandra responded to that the way a flower responds to sunlight. She turned toward Renee naturally, instinctively, without even seeming to notice she was doing it. Patricia did not grow up bitter about this. She grew up practical. She told herself for most of her childhood and all of her teenage years and most of her 20s that love between parents and children does not always look equal, and that equality is not the same thing as fairness, and that her mother did love her just differently. She kept that story going through a lot of moments that tested it. The birthday where Sandra spent $300 on a dress for Renee and gave Patricia a gift card. The graduation where Sandra cried when Renee walked across the stage and was on her phone during Patricia's. The job offer Patricia got that Sandra responded to with a polite nod, and the job Renee turned down that Sandra spent 2 weeks consoling her over. Patricia filed each of these moments away not with anger but with a kind of quiet, careful understanding of who her family act. Yoli was versus who she had once hoped they might be. She had moved back into the family home 3 years before the day her mother told her to leave. She had been living in an apartment across town, working as a medical billing specialist at a mid-size healthcare group, doing well enough, saving money, building something small and steady. Then Vera's first cardiac episode happened, and the doctor sat Sandra down and explained that Vera could not be alone through the recovery period, that she needed consistent supervision, consistent medication management, and someone who could get to her quickly if something went wrong in the night. Sandra had a full-time job managing a dental supply warehouse. Renee had recently moved into a place with her boyfriend Marcus and was not about to come back. Patricia was the one who said she would do it. She was the one who gave up her apartment, put her things in storage, and came home to take care of Vera. She did not ask for money for this. She did not ask for credit or recognition or a formal arrangement. She just came home and built a life around Vera's schedule. She learned which medications went with food and which ones could not be taken together. She learned the signs that meant a bad day was coming and the small adjustments that could head off a crisis. She kept a written log of Vera's blood pressure readings every single morning. She cooked the low-sodium meals the cardiologist recommended. She drove to every appointment, waited in every waiting room, and asked the questions Sandra never thought to ask because Sandra was not there. And in the evenings, she sat with Vera in the living room and they talked, really talked, the way Patricia had never quite managed to talk with her own mother. Vera knew what Patricia was doing. Not just the practical things, the driving and cooking and pill schedules, but the deeper thing. She knew Patricia had given something up. She knew Patricia was choosing to be there. She talked to Patricia about this sometimes in the evenings, quietly, the television turned down low, and she would take Patricia's hand and hold it for a moment and say things that sounded simple but landed deep. She said things like, "A person who shows up when it costs them something is worth more than 100 people who show up when it is convenient." She said things like, "I see you, Patricia. I want you to know that. I see exactly what you are doing and I am not going to forget it." Patricia held on to those words. She needed them because outside those evening conversations, the rest of the household dynamic had not changed. Sandra visited on weekends when she could, and she was warm and chatty with Vera, and she appreciated in the abstract that Patricia was there keeping everything together. But she did not ask about the details. She did not ask how the last appointment had gone or whether the new medication was helping or whether Patricia had had a hard week. She treated Patricia's presence in that house less like a sacrifice and more like a service, the way you might appreciate that the heat works without thinking too hard about who fixed the furnace. Renee visited even less. She came by once a month, sometimes less, brought flowers or a dessert, sat with Vera for an hour, made Sandra laugh, and then left. She had the ease of someone who knew the maintenance was being handled by someone else. She was not unkind to Patricia when she came. She was just comfortable in a way that Patricia had long ago stopped having the luxury of being. They were polite to each other, careful, the way you are with someone you share deep history with but no longer share much honesty. For 3 years, this was the pattern. Patricia managed everything. Sandra appreciated it in the background. Renee dipped in and dipped out. And Vera got older, slower, and increasingly clear in her own mind about what was happening in her family and what she wanted to do about it. Then came the week of the savings book. Vera kept her personal financial records in a small wooden box in her bedroom closet. It was not a secret. Everyone in the family knew the box existed. Inside it were old documents, some insurance papers, a few photographs, and a small blue savings book from the credit union where Vera had kept a separate account for years. The account had never been discussed in detail, but Patricia had seen the book before when helping Vera find other documents. She knew it existed. She had never opened it, never asked about it, and never touched it for any reason other than handing it back to Vera when Vera needed it. One Saturday afternoon in early November, Sandra came by the house as she usually did. She and Vera spent some time together in the bedroom, and Patricia stayed in the kitchen making lunch. At some point, Sandra asked Vera about the savings book. Vera said she had put it somewhere safe and would get it when she needed it. Sandra came out of the bedroom with a particular look on her face, the kind of look that meant she had already decided something and was working backward from the decision to find the evidence for it. She asked Patricia if she had seen the savings book. Patricia said she had not touched it recently. Sandra asked again, differently with an edge that had not been there the first time. Patricia said the same thing, she had not touched it. She did not know where it was. If Vera said she had put it somewhere safe, then it was somewhere safe. Sandra stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. Then she said very quietly that things had been going missing from Vera's room, that Vera was not always clear-headed these days, that someone who had access to the house all the time and was going through financial difficulties might be tempted. Patricia felt something cold move through her chest. She was not going through financial difficulties. She had cut her expenses and was still contributing to the household bills. She had not touched anything that belonged to Vera. She said all of this. Sandra listened with the expression of someone who has already made up her mind and is simply waiting for the other person to finish talking. Renee had come by that day too. She was in the living room and Patricia could see her from the kitchen, sitting on the couch with her phone in her hand. Renee heard everything. Patricia looked at her sister once and Renee looked down at her phone. Sandra said that maybe it would be better if Patricia found somewhere else to stay for a while, just until things settled, just until they could all think clearly. Patricia asked what things needed to settle. Sandra said she just thought some space would help everyone. Patricia stood there for a moment and looked at her mother's face, looking for something, a flicker of doubt. A sign that Sandra knew this was wrong, that this was a mistake, that she was doing the thing she had done Patricia's whole life, which was reach for the easiest conclusion and pointed at the person who would be least likely to make a scene about it. There was no flicker, Sandra had decided. Patricia went to her room, packed a bag with what she needed for a week, and walked back through the kitchen. She stopped at the doorway of the living room. Renee was still on the couch. Patricia looked at her sister for a long moment. Renee did not say anything. Patricia nodded once, the way you nod when something confirms what you already suspected but hoped was not true, and she walked out of the house. She sat in her car in the driveway for almost 10 minutes. Not crying, not shaking, just sitting there, feeling the full weight of what had just happened settle into her like a stone dropping into still water. She had given up her apartment for this family. She had given up 3 years of her independence, her savings, her social life, her weekends, her freedom to just pick up and go somewhere on a whim. She had done all of that out of love, real love for her grandmother, and out of a sense of duty to her family. And in return, her mother had looked her in the eye and suggested, without proof and without apology, that she had stolen from an old woman. She drove to her friend Deborah's house. Deborah was a woman she had known since high school, steady and honest, and the kind of person who would open her spare room without making a performance of it. Patricia stayed there. She did not call Sandra. She did not text Renee. She went to work each day and she thought carefully about what her next step was going to be. 2 days later, Vera called her. Vera's voice was quiet and careful on the phone, the way it got when she was trying to navigate something delicate. She told Patricia that the savings book had been found. It had been in the wooden box the whole time, tucked inside an old insurance envelope where Vera herself had put it months ago and then forgotten about it. She had found it herself that morning while looking for something else. She told Patricia this in a way that was also an apology, and Patricia received it as one. Then Vera said something else. She said, "I know what happened, Patricia, and I know what it cost you. Come see me tomorrow. Come in the morning before anyone else is here." Patricia went the next morning. She let herself in with the spare key she still had, which no one had thought to take back from her. Vera was in the kitchen in her chair by the window, already awake, with 2 cups of tea on the table. She looked at Patricia for a long moment when she walked in, the kind of look that is also a statement, and then she said, "Sit down. I want to talk to you about something important." What Vera said that morning, Patricia would carry with her for the rest of her life. Vera told her that she had spent a long time watching her family. She had watched Sandra love unevenly and tell herself she was being fair. She had watched Renee accept the advantages of being the favorite without ever questioning them. And she had watched Patricia absorb all of it year after year and keep showing up anyway. She told Patricia that what she had seen in those 3 years of caregiving was not just helpfulness, it was character. It was the kind of person Patricia was at her core, when no one was watching, when there was no reward for it, when it was just the right thing to do, and Patricia did it. Then Vera said, "I have made arrangements. I want you to know what they are because you deserve to know, and because I want you to hear it from me directly and not find out later in a way that feels like a surprise or a shock. I have spoken to my attorney. I have updated my will. The house and the accounts and most of what I have will go to you when I am gone, not because I do not love your mother or your sister, but because I am allowed to recognize what someone has actually done for me, and you are the one who was actually here." Patricia sat very still across from her grandmother. She had not expected this. She had not come to Vera that morning with any agenda or any hope for anything other than to see the woman she loved and to know that Vera did not believe Sandra's accusation. She had not thought about money or property or wills. She had thought about her grandmother's face on the phone and the way Vera's voice had said, "Come see me." That was all she had come for. She told Vera that she did not need her to do that. Vera told her she knew that. That was exactly why she was doing it. They sat together at that kitchen table for 2 hours that morning. Patricia helped Vera with her morning medications and made them both eggs and toast, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with Sandra or Renee or savings books or wills. They talked about Vera's husband, Gerald, who had been gone for 11 years. They talked about the garden, which had gone untended since the fall and which Vera wanted to replant in the spring. They talked about Patricia's work and her plans and what she wanted her life to look like in 5 years. Vera listened to everything and asked questions the way she always had, with genuine interest, like what Patricia wanted actually mattered, like Patricia's future was something worth thinking seriously about. Patricia drove back to Deborah's house that afternoon with something different sitting in her chest. Not victory, not satisfaction exactly, something quieter than that. A sense that the truth had somewhere to rest now, that it had been seen. She did not go back to Sandra's house. Sandra called her twice that week and Patricia let the calls go to voicemail. The messages were careful and not quite apologetic, the kind of messages that acknowledged something went wrong without quite taking responsibility for the wrong. Sandra said she hoped Patricia was okay. She said she had heard the savings book had turned up. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings and that Patricia should come home when she was ready. Patricia listened to both messages and then put her phone face down on the desk and went back to work. She found a new apartment the following week. A small one-bedroom in a complex about 10 minutes from the hospital where most of her medical billing clients were based. It was affordable, it was clean. It was hers in a way that the family house had stopped feeling like a long time ago. She signed the lease, picked up her things from storage, and moved in on a Saturday with help from Deborah and another friend from work named Camille. She still visited Vera. She went twice a week, on Tuesday evenings after work and on Sunday mornings. She still managed Vera's medications and drove her to appointments. Nothing about her care for Vera changed. The only thing that changed was where Patricia slept at night and whether she was in the same house as Sandra when she did not need to be. Sandra noticed the visits. She made comments, careful ones, about how dedicated Patricia was, how she really did love her grandmother. Patricia received these comments pleasantly and without responding to the layer underneath them. She was not there to perform anything for her mother. She was there because Vera was important to her, full stop, with no other calculation attached. Renee started coming around more. Not dramatically more, not in a way that would have required her to rearrange her life significantly, but more. She brought lunch once and stayed for 3 hours. She called Vera on weekday evenings. Patricia noticed this and did not say anything about it. She was not keeping score. She was just watching, the way she had always watched, carefully and without pretending not to see. 6 months after Patricia moved into her new apartment, Vera had a second cardiac episode. This one was more serious than the first. She was admitted to the hospital for 4 days, and during that time, Patricia was there every day after work and on the weekend, bringing Vera the books she liked and the particular brand of ginger tea that Vera preferred and that the hospital cafeteria did not carry. Sandra came and sat in the waiting room and cried and called relatives and made the kind of noise that grief makes when it is mixed with guilt. Renee came on the second day with Marcus and sat for 2 hours and left looking pale. Vera recovered. She came home thinner and more tired, and the doctor was clear with the family that this recovery would need to be more carefully managed than the last one. Patricia quietly reorganized her work schedule to make Tuesday mornings free so she could be at the house during the period when Vera's risk was highest. She did not announce this, she just did it. It was during this recovery period that Sandra first began to sense that something had shifted in ways she did not fully understand yet. She noticed that the attorney who had managed Vera's affairs for years, a man named Franklin Ayers who had known the family for 2 decades, called the house twice asking to speak with Patricia specifically. She noticed that Vera would sometimes reference conversations she had apparently had with Patricia about things Sandra had not been told about. She noticed that the wooden box in Vera's closet, the one that had started the whole terrible chain of events, now had a small envelope on top of it with Patricia's name written on it in Vera's handwriting. She did not ask about the envelope, not directly. She mentioned it to Renee, and Renee mentioned it to Marcus, and Marcus, who was the kind of man who thought out loud without much filter, said something at Sunday dinner about how it was probably just sentimental things, family letters and photographs and that sort of thing, and that Patricia would probably share whatever it was when the time came. Sandra smiled and agreed and changed the subject, but she had a look behind her eyes that Patricia recognized. It was the look of a woman who had begun to suspect that the math did not add up the way she had assumed it did. The moment things became fully clear to Sandra came in the spring of the following year. Vera had been stable through the winter, slower but present, her mind still sharp and her opinions still firm. In March, she had a conversation with Sandra that Sandra came away from looking unsettled in a way she could not quite mask. She called Patricia that evening, and this time Patricia answered. The call was not confrontational. Sandra was careful. She asked how Patricia was doing. She said she had been thinking about the fall, about the accusation, about the savings book, and she said she was sorry for how that had gone. It was the clearest apology Sandra had ever offered Patricia on anything, and Patricia received it genuinely, without sarcasm and without the kind of cold silence that would have been easy to give. She accepted the apology. She told her mother she appreciated it. She did not say everything was fine, because it was not, and Patricia had passed the age of pretending things were fine when they were not. Sandra then said, carefully, that she had heard from Vera that some arrangements had been made. She said she just wanted to understand, for planning purposes, what those arrangements might look like. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, gently but clearly, that any arrangements Vera had made were Vera's to explain, and that if Vera had chosen to share them with Sandra directly, then that was between them, and that Patricia was not going to be the one to speak for Vera's decisions. Sandra was quiet on the other end of the line. Patricia said, Mom, I want you to know that I am not angry with you. I really am not. I am still here for Grandma. That has not changed and it will not change. But I am not going to pretend that things between us are the same as they were before, because they are not, and I do not think pretending would help either of us. Sandra said quietly that she understood. Patricia said good night and ended the call. She sat for a while in her apartment after that, in the small living room she had furnished piece by piece over the past months, and she thought about what it meant to say something true to someone who was not ready to hear it and have them say they understood. She did not know if Sandra did understand, really. She did not know if understanding and changing were the same thing for her mother. But she had said what was true, and that felt like enough for tonight. Renee called 3 days later. This call was less careful than Sandra's. Renee had always been better at the surface of things than at the underneath. She opened with small talk, asked about Patricia's apartment, said she should come see it sometime, laughed in the way she laughed when she was nervous. Then she said, Look, I just want to clear the air about what happened last fall. I feel terrible about it. I should have said something when Mom was talking to you like that. Patricia said, Yes, you should have. Renee was quiet for a second. She had not expected Patricia to anger so directly. She said, I know I should have. I guess I just did not want to make things worse. Patricia said, staying silent when someone is being falsely accused does not prevent things from getting worse. It just means you chose to let them get worse without your fingerprints on it. Another silence. Then Renee said, "That is not fair, Patricia." Patricia said, "I know you think that, but I watched you sit on that couch and look at your phone while Mom told me to leave a house I had spent 3 years caring for. That is what happened. I am not going to rewrite it to make it easier for either of us." Renee said she had not known what to say. Patricia said, "You could have said, 'Mom, we do not even know if the book is missing yet.' You could have said, 'Let us look before we accuse anyone.' You could have said nothing and just stood up and walked into that kitchen and stood next to me, and that alone would have meant something. But you did not do any of those things." The call did not end warmly. Renee said she hoped Patricia could find a way to let it go at some point. Patricia said she had already let go of the anger. What she was not willing to let go of was the truth of what had happened. Those were two different things. They agreed to talk again soon, and both of them knew they probably would not. The season turned warmer. Patricia planted a small container garden on her apartment balcony, tomatoes and basil and one large pot of marigolds. She worked and saved and paid her bills and went to see Vera twice a week and slowly, piece by piece, built the life she had interrupted 3 years ago to come home and take care of someone else. She was not angry. This is important to say clearly because it would have been easy to be angry, and anger would have been understandable, and no one who knew the full story would have blamed her for it. But Patricia had spent a long time carrying other people's weight, and she had learned something about weight over the years, which was that the ones you carry out of love eventually become light, and the ones you carry out of resentment become heavier every day. She had chosen not to carry the resentment. Not for Sandra's sake or Renee's sake, but for her own. She also knew something that neither Sandra nor Renee fully understood yet, which was that her relationship with Vera was not transactional. She had not cared for Vera in order to receive anything. She had cared for Vera because Vera was her grandmother and she loved her and it was the right thing to do, and that foundation was solid in a way that nothing anyone said or accused or assumed could move. Vera knew this too. That was what made the choice Vera had made feel clean rather than complicated. Summer brought heat and longer evenings, and a company reorganization at Patricia's job that resulted in a promotion she had been quietly working toward for 2 years. She became the senior billing coordinator for the cardiology and internal medicine divisions, which came with a salary increase significant enough to let her begin seriously rebuilding her savings. She called Vera on the evening she found out, and Vera told her she had known all along that Patricia was underestimated at that job. She said it in the tone she used when she was very pleased about something but did not want to make too large a production of it. Sandra sent a text that week saying she had heard through the family grapevine and was proud of Patricia. Patricia responded with a thank you and left it at that. What Patricia did not know in those summer months was that Franklin Ayers had reached out to Vera in June about a technical update to some of the property documents, and that during that meeting Vera had made a small clarifying change to one of the trust documents that further solidified Patricia's position as the primary beneficiary of the house and the savings accounts. Vera told Patricia about this at their Tuesday evening visit over tea, in the same quiet, matter-of-fact tone she used for everything important. She handed Patricia a copy of the updated document and said, "You should have this. Keep it somewhere safe." Patricia took it home and put it in a folder in her desk, and she did not tell anyone about it. In September, Vera's health declined again. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a tide goes out, slowly enough that you almost do not notice until you look back and see how far the waterline has moved. Her appetite decreased. She tired more easily. The cardiologist had a conversation with the family in October that was gentle and careful and made certain things clear without stating them bluntly. Patricia sat in that appointment and took notes. Sandra sat beside her and held Vera's hand. Renee was not there for that one. She arrived 2 days later and sat with Vera and cried, and Vera patted her hand and said, "Now stop that, I am still right here." Through the fall, Patricia managed Vera's care with an intensity she did not shown even in the first caregiving period. She researched palliative support options. She spoke with a home health nurse named Gloria who came twice a week and who was competent and kind and who Patricia gave thorough updates to every visit so nothing fell through the gaps. She slept at the house 3 nights a week, setting up her old room again, making sure Vera had someone close in the difficult overnight hours. Sandra also stayed some nights. They were in the house together in those weeks in a way they had not been since Patricia moved out, and they moved around each other carefully and without conflict, united by something larger than either of them. This was, Patricia thought, what family was supposed to feel like, not the performance of it, but the actual practice, showing up in the difficult part, being present when it counted. She was glad Sandra was there. She did not withhold that gladness from her expression or her manner. She offered her mother cups of tea and sat beside her in the evenings, and let the closeness exist without requiring that it resolve everything that had come before it. Vera passed in late November. It was a Tuesday evening, which meant Patricia was there. Gloria had been by that afternoon. Vera had been awake and communicative for most of the day, which the nurse said sometimes happened near the end, a clarity and presence that arrives unexpectedly. Vera and Patricia had talked for an hour in the late afternoon, and Vera had said things that Patricia would spend years returning to. She said that a long life teaches you to recognize what is real from what is performed, and that the most important thing Patricia could do going forward was to trust her own perception of people. Because Patricia's perception had always been accurate, she had simply been too patient with the people her perception correctly identified as being less than they owed her. She said, "I want you to live well, Patricia, not just comfortably. Well, do you understand the difference?" Patricia said she did. Vera closed her eyes and slept and did not wake up. The grief was real and large, and Patricia did not try to minimize it. She sat with Gloria for a while after and then called the appropriate people and then sat alone in Vera's kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet in the way houses become after someone important has left them. Patricia made herself a cup of tea because she did not know what else to do with her hands, and she sat at the same table where Vera had sat across from her a year ago and told her what she had arranged, and she let herself feel all of it without trying to organize it into something manageable. Sandra arrived within an hour. She had been called by the nurse. She came in and saw Patricia at the table, and something passed across Sandra's face that Patricia could not fully read, something between sorrow and recognition, the look of a woman who has just stepped into a room and understood, all at once, how much had happened in it that she was not present for. They sat together, they cried. Sandra did not ask about the will that night, and Patricia was grateful for that. They just sat together with their grief, and that was enough. The weeks that followed Vera's passing were complicated in the practical sense and surprisingly clear in the emotional one. Franklin Ayers contacted Sandra, Patricia, and Renee within 2 weeks to schedule a meeting about Vera's estate. Sandra took the call and told Patricia about it in a tone that was careful and controlled. Patricia agreed to attend. She did not offer information, and Sandra did not push for any. The meeting happened at Franklin Ayers' office, a comfortable two-room space in a professional building downtown, with heavy wooden furniture and a window that looked out onto a small garden. Franklin was a precise man in his 60s with the manner of someone who had delivered a great many complicated truths to families over the years and had learned exactly how to do it without creating more damage than necessary. He read through the relevant sections of Vera's will and trust documents in clear, plain language. The family house, the vehicle, and the primary savings accounts went to Patricia. Vera had also left each of her daughters, meaning Sandra and Sandra's sister who lived in another state, a sum from a separate account, enough to be meaningful but modest relative to the full estate. Renee received several of Vera's personal items, a collection of jewelry, a cedar chest, and a set of dishes that Renee had admired as a child. Sandra sat very still while Franklin read. Renee sat next to her, and her expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, calculation, something that looked briefly like hurt, and then a careful blankness that she held for the rest of the meeting. Marcus was not present. He had stayed in the waiting room at Renee's request, which Patricia thought was a wiser decision than most people would have given Renee credit for making. When Franklin finished reading, he asked if there were questions. Sandra said, after a long pause, that she wanted to understand the timeline. She wanted to know when these arrangements had been made and whether they had been made in a period when Vera's health or mental clarity might have been compromised. Franklin said respectfully and firmly that the arrangements had been made over a period of several years, with the most recent updates completed more than 8 months ago, at a time when he had personally conducted the standard assessments and found Vera to be fully clear-minded and aware of what she was signing. He said that Vera had been consistent in her intentions across multiple meetings and had articulated her reasoning with specificity and care. He said that there was, in his professional judgment, no basis for a challenge on those grounds. Sandra nodded slowly. She looked at Patricia. Patricia looked back at her, steady and without apology and without performance. She had not arranged this, she had not asked for it. She had simply been the person who showed up, and Vera had chosen to recognize that. There was nothing in Patricia's expression that said, "I told you so," because Patricia did not feel that. She felt sad, actually, in a low, tired way. She felt sad that it had taken all of this for her family to see something that had been true the whole time. The drive home from Franklin's office was quiet. Patricia sat in her car in the parking garage for 10 minutes before starting the engine. She thought about the house, about the oak trees over the street, about the kitchen where she and Vera had sat at the table and talked about Gerald and gardens and what a person's life was actually supposed to look like. She thought about the savings book, small and blue and unremarkable, that had started the sequence of events that had led her here. She thought about what it meant to be seen, truly seen, not appreciated in the abstract, not thanked in the moments when thanks were easy, but actually recognized for what you had given and what it had cost you. She had spent most of her life not expecting that from the people closest to her. Vera had given it to her anyway. She started the car and drove to her apartment. She watered the container garden on her balcony, which was done for the season now but which she had not fully cleared yet. She made dinner. She called Deborah and talked for an hour about small things, nothing in particular. She went to bed at a reasonable time. Sandra called her 2 days later. This call was harder for Sandra than the earlier ones had been. Patricia could hear it in her voice, a quality of effort, of a person pushing through their own discomfort to say something that needed to be said. Sandra said, I did not handle things fairly with you. Not just the savings book, for a long time, I know that. I have known it for a while, honestly, and I have not done enough about it. I am sorry, Patricia, I am truly sorry. Patricia sat with this for a moment. She thought about all the ways she could respond. She thought about the versions of herself she had been over the years, the younger Patricia who would have grabbed onto this apology and tried to turn it into a bridge, the angrier Patricia she had sometimes feared becoming who might have let the apology land somewhere cold and given nothing back. She found neither of those versions in herself on this particular evening. She said, I hear you, Mom, and I believe you mean that. I want us to have a real relationship going forward, not a performance of one. A real one where we are honest with each other and we stop pretending things are fine when they are not. I am willing to build that if you are. Sandra said she wanted that too. Her voice was thick. Patricia said, okay, then that is what we will work on. She did not fold. She did not give Sandra the reassurance that everything was already forgiven and forgotten and back to normal, because it was not back to normal. It was the beginning of something different if they chose to make it that, and Patricia was willing to be part of making it, but not on terms that required her to pretend the past had not happened. The conversation with Renee came about a week later. Renee came to the apartment in person, which Patricia had not expected. She brought nothing with her and she sat on the small couch in Patricia's living room and she looked around at the space, at the bookshelves and the container herbs Patricia had brought in from the balcony for the winter and the framed photograph of Vera on the wall, and she said, you built a real life here. Patricia said, yes, I did. Renee said, I think I have been treating you like you were the backup option my whole life. Not consciously, but that is what I did, and I am sorry. This was the most honest thing Renee had ever said to her. Patricia recognized it as such. She said, I know you did not do it to be cruel, but it still cost me things. I want you to understand that, not to hurt you with it, but because I think we need to actually understand each other if we are going to be real sisters going forward. Renee said, I think I have been afraid of you for a long time. Not afraid of you specifically, but afraid of how clear you are about things. You see things and you say them and you do not back down from them, and I never knew how to be around that because I have always been better at smoothing things over than at looking at them directly. Patricia looked at her sister for a moment. This was not the conversation she had expected to have. She had expected defensiveness or more careful distance or the kind of surface warmth that looked like closeness but was not. She had not expected this degree of honesty from Renee. She said, that is the most real thing you have said to me in years. Renee looked at her hands. She said, I know. They sat together for a while. Patricia made tea. They did not resolve everything in that afternoon because you cannot resolve decades of imbalance in a single conversation, and Patricia was past the point of expecting clean endings. But something shifted between them, something small and solid, the way the first stone placed in the right position can eventually hold the whole arch. In the months that followed, Patricia worked with Franklin Ayers to manage the transition of Vera's estate. The house was officially transferred to her name in the late winter. She went back and forth for weeks about what to do with it. She had her apartment, which she liked and had made into something that was genuinely hers. The house was large for one person, and it carried weight, the weight of everything that had happened in it, the good and the difficult all layered together the way old houses accumulate time. She decided eventually to move back into the house. Not because she felt compelled to, not because of any family expectation, but because it was Vera's house and Vera had given it to her and Patricia wanted to live in it, to plant the garden in the spring the way Vera had said she wanted to sit in the kitchen where they had talked over tea and make the space into something that honored what had happened there. It was her home now, in a way it had never quite been before, not because she was living in it to serve someone else's needs, but because it was hers and she chose it. She gave her apartment notice and moved back in February. She repainted the kitchen the color Vera had always wanted it, a warm deep green that made the morning light look different, softer and richer. She planted the garden in April, the same plants Vera had grown before the later years when the garden had gone untended, tomatoes and pole beans, and the particular climbing roses along the back fence that Vera had planted the year she and Gerald had moved in. Sandra came to see the garden in May. She stood in the backyard and looked at the roses and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said she would have loved this. Patricia said, I know. They stood there for a while together in the garden that Vera had started 50 years ago and that Patricia was continuing, and the distance between them was not gone, but it was smaller than it had been and it was honest, and that was something. Renee came to dinner in June without Marcus, just the two of them. They cooked together in the kitchen that was now the deep warm green, and they talked differently than they had before, more carefully and also more honestly. The way you talk with someone when you have both agreed to stop pretending that the version of your relationship you perform for the outside world is the same as what is actually true between you. Patricia did not become someone who forgot. She did not develop a convenient amnesia about the savings book in the kitchen doorway and the sound of her mother's flat, certain voice telling her that some space would help everyone. She did not pretend that Renee's silence on the couch had not been a choice or that it had not told her something important. She remembered. She would always remember. The difference was that remembering no longer required her to be in pain. It just required her to be clear. She was clear about who she was. She was clear about what she had done and what it had cost her and what it had ultimately made possible. She was clear about what she would and would not accept going forward from her mother, from her sister, from anyone in her life. She had spent too long being the person who absorbed the discomfort of others in order to keep the peace, and she had learned the hard way and the only way that lesson really lands, that keeping the peace is not the same thing as being at peace. Vera had understood that. Vera had given her a house and a savings account and a document that Franklin Ayers had filed correctly and properly in triplicate, and all of that mattered in the practical sense. But what Vera had really given her was simpler than any of that. She had given her the experience of being truly seen by someone who had every reason to see clearly and had chosen to look anyway. That was what Patricia carried out of everything that had happened. Not the house, not the accounts, not the satisfaction of watching the people who had underestimated her have to reckon with what they had lost. She carried the knowledge that she had shown up when it counted, not because anyone was watching and not because she expected a reward, but because she was the kind of person who does that, who has always been that kind of person, even when the people around her were too busy to notice. She sat in the garden on a warm evening in July in the chair Vera used to sit in near the climbing roses, and she thought about what it means to be patient. Not passive, not accepting of everything, not too careful to ask for what you deserve. Patient in the way that a person is patient when they know who they are and they are willing to wait for the world to catch up to that truth. She had been patient for a long time, she was still patient. The difference was that she was also, finally, fully at home in herself. The garden was blooming. The roses were the same ones Vera had planted in the beginning. Patricia was the one tending them now, and she planned to tend them for a very long time. If this story stayed with you, I want to ask you something before you go. Think about the Vera in your own life. Think about the person who saw you clearly when others looked past you. And think about the Patricia you might have been once or still are right now, the one who kept showing up even when showing up was not rewarded, even when no one said thank you, even when the people you gave the most to were the ones who trusted you the least. If that is you, I want you to leave a comment and tell me. Tell me what you kept showing up for. Tell me if the truth ever came out the way it did for Patricia. This community is built on stories that are real, stories that matter, and I read every single comment. If this reached you today, let me know below.